Hi, I'm Phil Castle. One of the things that isn't available in Captivate is a slider. So if you want to have a little slider bar to go back and forth, there isn't a native one inside there. So you can create one inside of a web page and use that. I have a little project that I did a little while ago, and I'll just show it to you. Take a look on the screen here. So we have this budget that we would give to students, and so they would then use these sliders to determine how much money they're going to spend on different things within their school year. And then they would do something like this, and then they would submit this. There would be a submit button, and then we could then go through the process of evaluating their choices if they did a good job or not. So I was going to show you something like this on how to create something like this, but it is a little complex. There's a lot of moving parts, and the pun is intended in there. So I decided to do something a little bit simpler, and maybe share that how I built that. So if we go back to the screen, take a look at this Captivate project. And so what we have is we're going to take a look at how many days you have for toilet paper. So here we can slide how many rolls we have. And so I can say, for example, I have 100 rolls and I visit the toilet maybe 5 times a day. That's going to last 640 days. So you can see how the numbers are appearing down here. So when I move the slider, which is a web object, I'm displaying the content down here, and this content is Captivate. So if I increase my visits per day, so for example, if I visit 10 times a day, you can see that the visits per day are 10 down here. That's going to last me 320 days. And so we have a lot of people that are hoarding toilet paper. It's going to last them a long time for the toilet paper that they're hoarding. So let's take a look at the breakdown. And rather than going right into the code, what I want to do is look at the logic, and I'm going to break it down small bits and pieces at a time to help you understand what I was doing. So this is the body of the web page that I have created. So rather than just looking at the whole thing and see how it's overwhelming, why don't we attack this one line at a time? So I do have a table. I set up a table. The width is at 100%. So depending on the size of the area that the web page is in, I can rescale, or the sliders are going to rescale. Then after that, I have table rows, and that's what the TR tag is, and the closing TR tag. So you can see there's the TR for one row, and the other closing TR for the closing of that first row. There's the second row, and there's the closing tag for the second row. After that, we have these TD tags, and TD is for table data. So these are the columns within that one row. So I have a table row, and then I have the table columns, or the table data cells. So you'll see the very first line, table width, 19%, the line is right, and it has rows. And then you close off the TD tag. Then the next one you can see is the width is 72%, and then the third column, the width is 79, or 9%. Now let's just look at the top row here, and I've broken the code down so you can see it a little bit better. So you see there's the first two TD tags, table data cells, and then there's the third one that's in white at 9%. Then we have this line here, and we look at this. This is the actual slider. So it's an input type which is used for form, and the input type is going to be range. The maximum is going to be 144, so the maximum you can have for the rolls is 144 rolls. The minimum will be at 0. This has to be unique. This is an ID, and an ID means it's a unique element, so there can be no other items within the web page that has this ID. And then value is the starting value. What value do you want to start at? And here we're starting at 10. So I could say, for example, if I wanted to say, well, maybe most people have 24 roles, I could just change that number to 24 when the web page loads up, or when this web object starts inside of the Captivate file, it'll start off at 24. And then, of course, I have the style. I set the width to 400 pixels. I could change that to a percentage, which I probably should do if I want to make it responsive. Down here, we look at the output for roles, and this output for equals roles points to the ID for the roles. So you see the ID for that range, ID is roles, so the output here is for the roles. And then it has its own unique ID called show roles, and then I close off the output, and then close off the table data tag. There are two important things. One is every web page has a body tag, and so the body tag basically just looks like this. But one of the things that I had to do was wait for the whole web page to be loaded Once the web page is loaded, then I run this function called init sliders. So this is a JavaScript function. A web page starts at the top and works its way to the bottom. So I cannot have any functions or any code in the head that are going to call parts of the web page, like those sliders, until the sliders have been loaded. So what we have then is this event called onload. So when all of the content for the web page is loaded, then I'm going to call this particular function. So this is what the init sliders function looks like. And again, it looks like it's a lot of information, so why don't we just break it down. At the very beginning here, we have a variable called troles, and I'm going into the document, which is your web page, and I'm going to get an element by an ID. And remember, I pointed out that that range had an ID of roles. So troles is a variable that points to roles. Next, we have that troles that we just defined up above, and we add what's called an event listener. And the event listener we're adding is on input. So when you move the slider, you're inputting values to this object or to this ID. So what we want to do is we create this function that when you start to move the slider, we're going to get the value, this stop value, take that and put it into the roles output value. Remember, we had that roles output. That was the second line, the TD, or actually the third TD cell. So we're taking the value from the slider and putting it into that output using this particular type of function. And roles output is defined right here. So we have the document.get elements by ID, show roles. So now we have the slider will now work in this case, because it'll be able to, anytime you start to move the slider, it's going to fire the event, this add event listener, and then the values will be inputted and inserted into the web page automatically. So if we look at the slight teal or green color, this is what we have for the second one. So we have one for the number of visits, and in yellow we have the ones that we would use, or the code we use for the number of rolls of toilet paper. Now the second note that's really important is you have to have a way to connect the HTML JavaScript to the Captivate JavaScript. And this, surprise, surprise, is pretty easy. And it's just this one line. So somewhere within the JavaScript, I need to run this line. So I'll say parent, which is the parent of the entire web page, iframe slider equals window. So the JavaScript, when we get to Captivate, and I'll just quickly show you what the Captivate file looks like. I'll have to just bring this up. This is my Captivate file, and so I have my total roles here, and these are all my variables. You can see with the dollar signs, those are the variables. And what I have here in the Captivate file is, if I go to on enter frame, I have an action here, and I'm going to execute the JavaScript. And this is what the JavaScript looks like. It's something like this. I could zoom in, very difficult to kind of read on here. But what I want to do is I want to kind of break that down so you can see this a little bit better. So this is what the code looks like. And again, it's, there's a lot to it. So let's break it down a piece at a time. I have a variable here, iframe slider. And it was also declared inside of the JavaScript that's within the web page. Then I have this other variable, cp equals document.captivate. So cp then points to anything that I need in Captivate, and I don't necessarily always need that, but it's something out of habit I do, and in this case I don't believe I need to use it, but it's just a line that I tend to have in there. If I need to activate a button or change the state, I need to do something like this, and at one point I was doing that. I just left the code in there. I have this other variable called myInt, and it's short for myInterval, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up an interval. So here's the code for set myInterval, get value 500. Now this 500 indicates that it's going to call the get value function every half second. If it was 1000, then once a second get value gets called. Right now I have it set at 500. You can play with this number. If I set it down to 100, that means every 10th of a second the get value function will be called. And that means it's more resources on the computer. It's not too bad if it's a desktop, but if it's a mobile device, you might find that it's going to drain the battery pretty quickly. So it's a number that you can play with and see what works for you and for the coding you're doing. I think half second works. There's a bit of a lag. You can see the lag, but for the most part, I think it's fine. So here's the get value function, and then you can see the closing brace down at the bottom of the screen. One of the first things that I do is I clear that interval. So I've called this a set interval, and I want to clear it. I don't want it to be called again. I know the code is going to run within, all this code will run in less than half a second, but just to make sure that nothing does duplicate itself, I want to clear that interval, so it's not going to be called anymore. Then I have this line, or these two lines that I have here, and basically what I'm doing is I am taking variables that are in JavaScript and I'm setting them and saving them in Captivate. And there's functions, Adobe's put together a really nice website that show you the JavaScript functions that are available within Captivate. So these here are the variables that you would have inside of the web page. So t-rolls and t-visits. Those are the variables that hold on to those numbers. And what I want to do then is I'm going to the iframe slider dot t-rolls. So to access any variables that are in the web object, I have to use that iframe slider dot and then the name of the variable. The other variables that we have here, those are the Captivate variables. So total roles and total visits are Captivate variables. So I'm taking the content from the web JavaScript and saving them into the Captivate variables. So it's kind of confusing sometimes, so hopefully that helps keep things straight. Then I have a variable here called PPD, and this is going to look at the number of visits that you have. So iframe slider, again, iframe slider is going back to the web page, and it's going to get the number of visits that you have and multiply it by 5. Those two slashes you see afterward are the remark statements, estimating using 5 squares per visit. The next line is total toilet paper, iframe slider.trolls, and it's time 160. So it's estimating each roll has 160 squares on it. Some rolls have that double and triple or whatever. Let's just stay with single rolls, so 160 squares. Then I have these lines. This variable JS days is going to equal, and when you see something within a bracket, you always do something in the bracket first. So you have the TTP, which is the number of visits times 5, divided by, and then we have the PPD, and then what we're going to do is we round that off. So we don't have any number of fractions like 64.83972, that sort of thing. We want to round it off either up or down. And then what we do is we go back to the set variable, which we saw up above when we were grabbing values out of JavaScript and put them into Captivate. So what we're doing in this case is we are getting variables from JS days and putting them inside of total days. So JS days, you can see on the line above that window.cpa, you can see how we've calculated JS days. That's a JavaScript variable that's within Captivate. It's not in the web object, it's in Captivate. So because it's in Captivate, I don't have to have that iframe slider dot JS days. I just have to use JS days because it's defined within Captivate. Then finally, once I'm done, what I do is I set my integer back to this get value to 500. So what it'll do is set the interval, so every half second I'm going to call this and repeat all of this code again. So it will constantly keep updating the code as we go. So that is most of the work of what we have to do to get that to function. Now, what I did to get this piece in here is I actually opened up I have a web file right here. And this is the HTML code that's in place to get the that slider to work. So I can double click on this, show it in the browser, and it just slides back and forth. What I'm going to do is right click on it, and I'm going to say send to, and then to a compressed file. And so there it is, sent as a compressed file, toilet paper calculator.zip. Then inside of here, I won't necessarily have to do this, but basically what I would do is I would say objects, web, and then I'm going to hit the browse button, and then I just have to go find it. So it's right here, and now it's loaded. So there is another, well, let's move that out of the way. So there's another version that's loaded. And turn off the scrolling, turn off the border, and you're ready to go. So all the code is in place to talk to between the web object and the Captivate variables, so it's in place, ready to go. So that is just a quick overview on how you can get a slider in. I'm going to post a zip file with the Captivate file here, as well as the web file, and hopefully you can start to tear this apart and make this work for yourself. So enjoy digging into sliders within Captivate.